All right, welcome to Literary Analysis Basics, video number 1. This is the first in a series of videos that will take you through how to analyze literature, and the things you need to know for your tests and or your project. So, the first thing you need to know is that you need to go get your outline if you don't have it already. You can probably find a copy in your folder, and if you can't find it there, I'm sure it's on the website, so you can download it. So if you need to do that, please do it now and then pause the video and then come back. Okay, we're going to start with the basics of literary analysis. Literary analysis is just the process of reading a text and examining the parts of it for deeper meanings. It sounds pretty simple. It actually is pretty simple. There are several things you need to know in order to analyze a piece of literature, so we're going to start with just the basics. The first one, and most obvious, is the title. This is your first impression of a piece of literature. Authors choose their titles for specific reasons. It's up to you to figure out how that title connects to the novel, and it always does. A couple examples. The Grapes of Wrath is a book about the Depression and the Dust Bowl era. And the title comes from the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a song. And in the song, it talks about God making everyone equal. So the title refers to equality. The Lord of the Flies gets its title from right within the book. The Lord of the Flies is a symbol in the novel. The boys cut off the head of a pig and they stick it on the end of a spear, and then they worship it. And it kind of represents Satan or the evil in men's hearts. But you wouldn't know that if you had never read the book. To correctly format a title for a work of literature, you need to follow one of two basic rules. And this is what you're being graded on, so this is the important part. First of all, longer pieces of work, such as novels, albums, newspapers, and anthologies, should be underlined or italicized to show that they are titles. Make sure you do one of those two things, otherwise I mark them wrong. The second rule that you need to follow is shorter pieces of work, such as short stories, song titles, newspaper articles, and poems, need to be quoted to show that they are titles of works. If you don't correctly format the title, I mark it wrong. It's also pretty misleading because we don't know what you're talking about, so be careful when you're taking your test or doing your project. The second thing we're going to talk about is the author. The author of a work is very important. This is the person who created it. So think about it as the owner. Most authors write under their own names, and so the book is by, and you know that. However, some authors use pseudonyms, which are really made-up names, to write certain novels. A lot of the time because they don't want them connected to their real name for some reason. So Stephen King, his pseudonym is Richard Bachman, and he wrote a couple of books under that name, and then of course later went back and claimed them and said, hey, I wrote these. Sherilyn Kenyon is also Kinley McGregor. She's my favorite novelist, and she writes one series under Sherilyn Kenyon, her own name, and then another series, a romance series, as Kinley McGregor, and she didn't want really the two to be connected, so she used the pseudonym for the other series. No matter under what name the author chooses to publish the novel, your job is to give appropriate credit by spelling his or her name correctly. So please make sure you copy carefully. All right, the third thing we're going to talk about, it's probably the longest section of this video, is genre, which is the category that the novel falls into. There are many genres of literature that you might come across in this class. We're going to talk about, I think, 25 of them. You're not going to see all of them, but just in case, we'll put them out there. The first one is a fable. A fable is a narration demonstrating a useful truth, especially in which animals speak as humans. Legendary or supernatural tales are all fables. So if you think about Aesop's fables, you will be in the right ballpark for this genre. The second genre we're going to talk about is the fairy tale, which is a story about fairies or other magical creatures, usually written for children. Think Tinkerbell. The next one is fantasy. Fantasy is fiction with strange or otherworldly settings or characters, or fiction which invites suspension of reality. Fantasy is really that category that takes us to other places and other times with things that can't possibly happen. Anything like The Hobbit is fantasy. Anything that takes you to another world like that is going to be in the fantasy genre. A fictional narrative is just fiction as we know it, a literary work whose content is produced by the imagination and is not necessarily based on fact, but it's differentiated between that and fiction in verse. Fiction in verse is a full-length novel with plot, subplots, themes, major and minor characters, in which the narrative is presented in verse form. So this is a really long poem. Not something you're going to read very often, but they're out there. Folklore. Folklore is the songs, stories, myths, and proverbs of a people or folk as handed down by word of mouth. Paul Bunyan fits into the folklore of Minnesota. We hear a lot of stories about him if you grow up here. Historical fiction is the next category. Historical fiction is a story with fictional characters and events in a historical setting. So historical fiction takes an actual event and then creates what might have happened there. The Last Silk Dress is a pretty well-known historical fiction novel taking place during the same time as Gone with the Wind. Horror is the next genre. Horror is fiction in which events evoke a feeling of dread and sometimes fear in both the characters and the reader. So horror novelists, people like Stephen King, so anything by Stephen King, Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, these are all horror novelists. They're out to scare you. The next one is humor. Usually a fiction full of fun, fancy, and excitement, meant to entertain and sometimes cause intended laughter. It can be included in any genre, but sometimes it's a genre on its own. My husband reads books by Louis Grizzard, who writes books just solely for the humor of them, and so they're humorous novels. The next one is legend. A legend is a story, sometimes of a national or folk hero that has a basis in fact, but also includes imaginative material. King Arthur is a legend, so if you think things like that, you'll be in the right category. The next one is metafiction, and you're probably not going to see too much metafiction, but we'll cover it. Metafiction is also known as romantic irony in the context of romantic works of literature. Basically, it's a book about someone writing a book which is designed to expose some kind of truth. It's thinking about what you're doing, so that's the definition of metafiction. Mystery. Mystery is one of my favorite genres. It's fiction dealing with the solution of a crime or the unraveling of secrets. I read a lot of Tammy Hoag, who does mystery. I read an entire series one summer about a cat who solved mysteries. It's the Cat Who books. They were pretty fun. The next one is mythology, which is a legend or traditional narrative often based in part on historical events that reveal human behavior and natural phenomena by its symbolism, often pertaining to the actions of the gods. Pretty much Greek, Roman, Norse, pick a mythology, they've all got stories. Poetry is the next one. Poetry is verse and rhythmic writing with imagery that creates emotional responses. Again, not too likely to read poetry in this course, but just so we know it's out there as a genre. All right, the next one is realistic fiction, which is a story that's true to life. Realistic fiction are things like John Grisham's novels, things that could really happen. Science fiction is the next genre, and science fiction is the opposite. It's a story based on impact of actual, imagined, or potential science, usually set in the future or on other planets. Think things like I, Robot, and you'll be in the right genre for science fiction. The next one is short story. Also not something you're likely going to read in this class, but just so you know the definition, a short story is fiction of such brevity that it supports no subplots. A short story tells one story, that's it, you see it, you get it. The next one is a tall tale. A tall tale is a humorous story with blatant exaggerations, swaggering heroes who do the impossible with nonchalance. So Paul Bunyan was a tall tale as well as being folklore. The next one is biography or autobiography. This is the narrative of a person's life, a true story about a real person. So Anne Frank is probably the most famous example of this. The next one is an essay. Again, not something you're likely to come across in this class. It's a short literary composition that reflects the author's outlook or point. Essays are usually nonfiction, and so we kind of don't read a whole lot of that in this class. The next category is narrative nonfiction. This is nonfiction that we might read in this class. Narrative nonfiction is factual information presented in a format which tells a story. Maya Angelou's autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is an example of narrative nonfiction. The next category is young adult fiction, also called young adult literature, juvenile fiction, or YA. This is fiction written, published, or marketed to adolescents and young adults. Think Divergent, Hush Hush, City of Bones. All of those series are young adult. The next category is adventure fiction, which is a genre of fiction in which an adventure or an exciting undertaking involving risk and physical danger forms the main storyline. Adventure fiction often doubles up on some of these other genres, but think things like Robinson Crusoe and you'll have an idea. The next genre is children's literature or juvenile literature. This is stories, books, and poems that are enjoyed by children. So there's a whole picture book genre, but actually Alice in Wonderland is actually children's literature. It's just that adults read it too because it's so much fun. The next one is historical novel. This is a novel set in the past and intended to evoke the conditions of a past period. It doesn't take a real event. It just sets the story in a historical period. So something like Timeline would be a historical novel. The next thing we're going to talk about is the characters. The characters are the people, the animals, or the beings who inhabit the novel. There are 4 types of characters that we divide them up into. The first 2 are the protagonist and antagonist. The protagonist is the main character, typically the person we're supposed to relate to in the novel. So it's the person through who we see the events. The antagonist is the force or the character which acts against the protagonist. It's not always a bad guy, it's just someone who wants something different than the main character. The next 2 types are dynamic and static. Dynamic characters change or grow or learn something throughout the novel. An antagonist is just as likely to be dynamic as a protagonist is because they very often learn lessons. A static character, on the other hand, does not change, grow, or learn anything throughout the novel. By definition, a protagonist cannot be a static character because by definition, a protagonist has to learn a lesson. The last thing we're going to talk about is the conflict. Conflict is the problem in the novel. There are 2 main types of conflict. The first one is internal conflict, which happens within a character's mind, making a decision or following a belief. And the second one is external conflict, which happens between the character and someone or something else, such as 2 people fighting, surviving a storm, or trying to change society as a whole. Those are examples of external conflict. All right, we come to the end of this video, so I will see you in part 2, and I will see you in class. Have a good day.